In a quiet Pennsylvania town, whispers still linger about an old house built at the end of the 19th century. Beneath its creaking wooden floors lies a bottomless cellar, where darkness swallows every trace of light. Those who dared to descend never returned. Only the echo of footsteps remains, repeating endlessly through the night. The house has changed owners many times, but no one has ever stayed for long. Now, a middle-aged man has moved in, clinging to the hope of a fresh start, unaware that the darkness has been waiting for him. And soon, Arthur turned off the main road just as dusk settled over the town. Autumn in Pennsylvania hung heavy in the air, damp, cold, and pressing down on everything, even his thoughts. The house waited at the bottom of the hill, a hulking shape of darkened timber, its roof sagging beneath the weight of age, its windows rotted and hollow like empty eyes staring into the void. The moment Arthur pushed open the door, he was swallowed by the smell of mildew and rotting wood. The hinges wailed in protest, a long metallic groan, like something grieving. The ceiling loomed high but shrouded in shadow, draped with cobwebs that fell like curtains. The floorboards groaned underfoot, each step echoing far too loudly for the size of the room, as if the house were hollow inside and slowly devouring every sound. He followed a narrow corridor where weak light seeped through dust-streaked windows, revealing peeling paint and dark stains creeping along the walls. The rooms lay abandoned, furniture cloaked in sheets, the chill sinking into his skin. The farther he walked, the heavier the air became, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself breathed at a slower, alien rhythm. At the end of the hallway, he noticed a door smaller than the rest. When he pulled it open, a yawning darkness stared back. A steep wooden staircase plunged downward, its steps slick and blackened with damp. From below drifted a breath of air, cold, earthy, smelling of stone and decay, carrying with it the sense of something endless. Arthur froze, his heartbeat pounding. He snatched a lantern from the hall, its yellow flame trembling as he lowered it toward the stairs. The light reached only the first few steps before being consumed by shadow. The silence below was oppressive, as though even sound refused to exist there. An inexplicable pull urged him forward. Arthur placed his foot on the first step. The wood groaned sharply. Then the sound died into nothing. He descended further, the lantern flickering, casting light on stone walls, slick with moisture. The deeper he went, the thicker the dark became, as if some enormous hand were closing around the space itself. Suddenly, he stopped. A chill threaded its way up his spine, an instinctive warning he couldn't ignore. He lifted his gaze downward and saw only a vast black pit with no end. The lantern flame sputtered, dimmed, and nearly died, leaving him stranded in a suffocating abyss. Heart racing. Arthur turned back and climbed quickly, his breath ragged. When the cellar door shut behind him, the sound reverberated through the house, like the heavy exhale of something ancient and waiting in the dark. He did not know that, with that single step, he had awakened what had been patient for more than a century. Nay, Awims down, deep. The first night in the old house dragged on like a trial. Arthur lay on the sagging wooden bed, the thin blanket useless against the chill that seeped from the floorboards and stone walls. Outside, the wind hissed through cracks in the shutters, but it could not mask another sound, rising from the depths below. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone were climbing the cellar stairs, one creaking step at a time. Each groan of wood reverberated through the silence, too precise, too human to dismiss. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself it was only the timbers settling in the night's cold. But the rhythm was undeniable. He tossed and turned until dawn, when at last the sound dissolved, as if it had never been there. The next morning, Arthur buried himself in chores to shake the unease. He dusted old tables, flung open the windows, let sunlight flood the rooms. Yet no matter how bright the day, the house remained damp and clammy. Out in the yard, he caught the gaze of an elderly neighbor standing motionless, cane in hand, watching. The wrinkled face gave no sign of feeling, only lingering too long on the half-open cellar door before turning away. That wordless glance etched itself into Arthur's mind like a silent warning. On the second night, the sounds returned. This time, they began faintly, as if from some unreachable depth. The measured rhythm struck through bone, louder and longer than before. Arthur sat upright, his pulse racing, listening. The footsteps climbed higher, step by step, then stopped just beyond the cellar door. He held his breath, his body rigid with terror. A dead hush followed. Then breathing, heavy, ragged, pressing against the wood. It crawled into his ears, hot and wet, until his skin prickled. Candle in hand, Arthur crept to the hallway. His legs trembled. The flame quivered with each of his own breaths. When his fingers brushed the icy iron handle, the sound cut off at once. He cracked the door open. Nothing. Only a slab of black silence, thick and endless. Yet a blast of frigid air rushed past him, reeking of damp earth and something faintly metallic, almost bloody. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, heart hammering, listening to the suffocating quiet pressing in from every wall. The days that followed unraveled into fragments. Each night, the footsteps came back. Sometimes near, sometimes far, sometimes slow, sometimes hurried. Never the same, never predictable. On the longest nights, they endured until morning, leaving Arthur hollow-eyed with exhaustion. The house itself became a chamber of echoes, bending every sound into warped reflections of something colder, crueler. And then, the house began to change. Window frames rattled, though the air outside was still. The walls seemed to flex, expanding and contracting with some uncanny rhythm. Wherever Arthur stood, the sound of the cellar found him, tapping against his thoughts like the heartbeat of an unseen thing. One storm-heavy night, as rain battered the roof, the footsteps grew louder than ever. Arthur strained to catch the rhythm, and froze as realization pierced him. The cadence was not random at all. It matched his own, the exact pattern of his descent down the cellar steps that first evening. He understood then. The thing below was not simply climbing upward. It was repeating him, mirroring his every step, calling him back. Arthur fled to his room, but the knowledge gnawed at him. The darkness beneath the cellar had begun to learn his rhythm, and each night it drew closer. Me. Daylight no longer brought comfort. For Arthur, each morning opened only into a hollow stretch of waiting until night. He woke with a gaunt face, eyes ringed in bruised shadows from sleepless hours. Daily routines fell away. Instead, he sat for long stretches in the hallway, eyes fixed on the cellar door, as though it might vanish if he dared to look elsewhere. The staircase seemed to possess its own pull, an invisible gravity. Whenever Arthur closed his eyes, he found himself placing a foot on the first step, hearing the drawn-out groan of wood that never ended. Each night, the footsteps returned, calling him downward. Fatigue, insomnia, and mounting tension twisted into something like addiction. He had to know what waited below. One afternoon, unable to resist, Arthur lit a lantern and opened the door. A rush of cold air surged up, carrying the sour breath of rotting earth. He began to descend, counting each step. 12, 25, 40. The numbers climbed rapidly, but no solid ground appeared. Only darkness thickening around him. He pressed on, shirt damp with sweat, heart battering his ribs. When he finally lifted the lantern, its glow revealed nothing more than a damp wall of stone, water dripping with the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat. The staircase stretched endlessly downward, no end in sight. The thought of having walked hundreds of steps made his skin crawl. Dizzy, he turned and climbed back up. Yet it took only minutes to return to the door, as though the impossible distance had folded in on itself. Arthur collapsed on the floor, chest heaving. The logic of space had broken. The staircase stretched and contracted at will, a trap that twisted time and distance alike. It did not lead simply into darkness. It bent reality to its own hunger. From that day, Arthur changed. He nearly lived by the cellar door, chair pressed close to the threshold, straining to catch every faint sound rising from below. Outside, the town carried on in the crisp chill of autumn. But inside, time stalled. The air thickened. Silence pressed close like a suffocating fog. One afternoon, a knock came. A tall, severe-faced town inspector stepped inside, moving through the rooms with a notebook, his presence filling the house with uneasy scrutiny. Arthur followed, heart pounding, terrified the man might touch the cellar door. But the inspector left without approaching it, leaving Arthur alone again with the waiting dark. Afterward, the footsteps changed. No longer slow, no longer patient. They grew rapid, frantic, like someone running, always chasing upward from some unseeable depth. Arthur sat entranced, listening for hours, until the rhythm began to sync with his own racing pulse. One night, he gave in. He opened the door and sat on the first step, lantern quivering in his hand. The echoes swarmed, pressing from every angle, impossible to distinguish from his own fevered thoughts. The darkness below swelled, crawling up the steps like a tide of black water. Arthur closed his eyes and saw himself descending forever, never turning back. The staircase had bewitched him, tightening its grip with every hour, every night. The haunting was no longer outside him. It had nested within. Arthur could no longer tell whether he chose to obey or was compelled by something older, deeper. The staircase had become part of him, and he knew, next time, he would not escape. Now, Inuini. The days drifted by in a haze. Arthur gazed at himself in the dust-covered hallway mirror, and the first thing that chilled him to the bone was the eyes. The thing in the mirror stared back at him longer than it should, as if there were a delay. When Arthur tilted his head, the reflection moved more slowly, its eyes faintly glowing with a light that did not belong to him. From that day, the reflection began to reveal subtle differences. Sometimes it smiled faintly while his real face remained expressionless. Sometimes the arm in the mirror moved sluggishly, as if trying to reach out. At night, when candlelight cast shadows on the walls, Arthur noticed that the figure in the reflection stood still when he walked, then vanished entirely for a fleeting moment, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. The whispers from the basement grew louder, At first, they were only indistinct murmurs, but then they became clearer, stretching his name in a heavy rhythm. The walls of the house seemed to pulse like living flesh, with cold air seeping through every crack. The windows were gradually consumed by darkness until daylight was reduced to a thin, pale layer that could no longer penetrate inside. One evening, when Arthur looked out into the yard, he saw his old neighbor stooping beside the fence. In the blink of an eye, a shadowy figure dragged the man toward the basement stairs, vanishing as if it had never been there. Arthur rushed out but found only emptiness, and the basement door stood ajar, trembling faintly as though someone had just touched it. Arthur's mind began to fracture. He saw himself in the mirror, descending the endless staircase, lantern trembling in his hand, eyes hollow. The image repeated, each time deeper, darker, until one night the reflection no longer followed him. Instead, it stood waiting on the 10th step, turning back with a face identical to Arthur's, but with a void-like gaze, as if inviting him. Arthur felt his body compelled forward. The house was silent, the air thick, every door tightly shut. The staircase yawned open like the mouth of an abyss. His shadow on the wall had vanished, replaced only by the imposter waiting below. Arthur knew that if he stepped down this time, he would never return. But the flame within his heart no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the basement. Arthur no longer resisted. On the final night, he opened the basement door, letting the cold coil around his body like invisible fingers. The staircase stretched before him, black and infinite. The lantern in his hand trembled, its meager light swallowed by the void, leaving behind shadows that expanded and contracted as if they were breathing. He began to descend. The groan of wood echoed, then dissolved into nothing. Each step sank deeper into his body, transforming into an alien rhythm that no longer belonged to Arthur. From the depths, whispers rose to meet him, merging with his footsteps, forming a ghastly chorus. Time no longer existed. Distance no longer mattered. There was only repetition. Arthur kept descending, counting in his head, but the numbers tangled and slipped away. When he looked up, the stairs still stretched on, endless, without destination. Around him, blurred figures emerged, emaciated, hollow-eyed shades trudging in the same eternal loop. They did not see him. They only continued, trapped like puppets in the punishment of darkness. Arthur realized with sudden horror that the footsteps he had heard night after night were never from another soul. They had always been his own, an echo of himself, bound forever in this warped space, the sound of a destiny already sealed. Panic flared. He tried to turn back, but his legs refused to obey. They carried him downward, steady and unyielding, until his steps blended seamlessly with the eternal echo. The lantern died, plunging him into the infinite pit, where there was no longer a line between man and shadow. By morning, the house was silent. A town inspector stopped by, jotting down notes about a suspicious disappearance. The basement door was closed, dust thick upon it, as though no hand had touched it in years. Arthur was gone without a trace, leaving only the house itself, cold and patient, waiting for the next soul. And at night, those who pass the slope swear they hear sounds rising from beneath the earth, footsteps, slow and deliberate, repeating endlessly, never fading. They say it is Arthur, now part of the basement itself, devoured along with all who dared to gaze into the darkness. Meow. In the backroads of rural Maine, where dirt paths twist into a forgotten valley, there lies an abandoned apple orchard left to rot since the 1970s. The trees stand blackened and skeletal, their brittle branches clawing at the sky like the bones of something long dead. Waist-high weeds choke the ground, and the locals steer clear of the land. At night, between the rows of lifeless trees, a constant murmur drifts through the wind, like prayers swallowed before they can be heard. They say it's the voices of those who vanished there, never to return. Now Eleanor, a woman in her 50s, has come back to reclaim the land that once belonged to her family. Knee. By late afternoon, Eleanor pulled her car to a stop before the rusted gate of the old farm. She stood in silence, staring down the moss-choked path that disappeared into the shadows of the orchard. The two-story wooden house emerged from behind the trees, its roof sagging, windows shattered, the wind whistling through the broken glass like a trapped animal's cry. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath her weight. The smell of mildew and decayed wood invaded her lungs. Beyond the house, the orchard stretched out like a vast graveyard. Hundreds of apple trees stood rigid and blackened, their brittle limbs reaching upward like skeletal hands frozen in prayer. Weeds strangled the roots, spilling across cracked furrows, obscuring the old paths. Yet, amid the desolation, Eleanor noticed something strange. A few branches shivered, leaves clattering together in a dry whisper. But there was no wind. Not even the faintest breath stirred the air. The sound grew sharper, rising like a chorus of murmurs carried from far away, before falling suddenly into silence. At the edge of the orchard, she saw a figure bent low at the base of a tree. A gardener, lean and mud-stained, moving with deliberate patience. He never lifted his head, never showed his face. Eleanor stood frozen, watching until the figure slipped behind a thicket and vanished, leaving only the raw emptiness of the ground behind. Turning back toward the house, Eleanor caught sight of another figure, a minister standing not far away. He paused only briefly, his eyes fixed on the orchard with a gaze that lingered like a warning left unspoken. Then he turned and drifted into the pale gray mist settling over the valley. Dusk drained the light from the sky, and Eleanor realized she was standing alone in the stillness. Not every tree here had withered. At the orchard's center, one apple tree towered above the rest, its leaves vivid, trembling under the last traces of daylight. It looked unnaturally alive, as though the entire orchard's stolen vitality had been poured into this single trunk. The sky collapsed into darkness. Eleanor felt the orchard behind her, vast and gaping, like a black mouth whispering for her to step inside. I'll many in the dark. A gray dawn bled across the fields, mist curling thick around the orchard, until it looked like a blurred silhouette suspended in silence. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, breathing in the damp chill, her eyes drawn once more to the single green tree at the center. Through the haze, its canopy glimmered with unnatural vitality, weighed down by countless swollen apples. She moved closer, her steps heavy on the wet earth. At the trunk, she realized these were no ordinary fruits. Their skins were misshapen, blistered, bulging with veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. Some hung grotesquely large, as though something inside them strained to break free. Eleanor's body recoiled, but her gaze clung to the sight. One apple dropped. The sound was wrong, hollow, echoing like a shell cracking underfoot. Its skin split open, releasing a thick black ooze that spread across the soil. Inside, for an instant, something small and round gleamed, An eye, human in shape, curling in on itself before collapsing into nothing, leaving only a wet stain seeping into the ground. Eleanor clenched her fists, but dared not stoop closer. From deep within the orchard, the murmurs began again. This time clearer, layered with many voices breathing as one, whispering like a desperate prayer. The sound slithered through the brittle branches, coiling along the trunks until it wrapped itself around Eleanor. She felt it crowding her ears, as though unseen bodies had gathered at her side, whispering just beyond her sight. Though before her stood only the corpses of trees. Movement caught her eye. The gaunt gardener had returned, carrying an old wicker basket. He approached the thriving tree and stooped, gathering the twisted fruit as they fell, placing each one gently into the basket. His face remained hidden in shadow, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of his motions carried more of ritual than labor. When the basket filled, he turned and slipped into the rows of dead wood, vanishing without a trace, leaving an emptiness that felt colder than before. The sun climbed higher, but its pale light could not banish the chill. Eleanor retreated into the house, carrying a dread she could not yet name. That night, as she sat alone in the dark, a steady plop echoed from the orchard, the sound of apples striking the ground. They fell in rhythm, each thud mingling with the relentless whispers that threaded through the night, a dirge without end. Eleanor closed her eyes, but the sound clung to her. It crept into her dreams, a voice that did not speak to her, but through her, as if the orchard had found its way into her mind. Arthur. On the third night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The valley outside lay in absolute stillness, yet the curtain by her window stirred, as if touched by an unseen hand. In the dark, she heard it, a faint sound at first, like shallow breathing, which slowly unraveled into whispers. They weren't confined to the porch. They seeped into the room, coiling around her bed, slipping into her chest like smoke. She sat upright, her pulse pounding. From the window, the orchard stretched wide beneath the pale wash of moonlight. The dead trees stood rigid, skeletal silhouettes on guard. And in the center, the lone living tree shivered violently, its leaves trembling, though not a breath of wind stirred. The whispers rose into a chorus, hundreds of voices woven together. Some words broke free, clear and sharp. They called her name. Familiar voices, voices she hadn't heard since childhood, voices long buried in memory. Eleanor descended the stairs, the rotted floorboards glowing faintly where the moonlight fell. When she opened the front door, a current of icy air wrapped around her, urging her toward the orchard. Each step sank into the damp earth with a dull, sucking thud, blending with the murmur that thickened around her. It no longer felt like sound. It clung to her, burrowing into her heartbeat, as if someone whispered directly into her ear. At the foot of the green tree, she froze. From its bark bled a viscous, tar-like sap, running down in glistening streaks. The soil beneath the roots pulsed, swelling, sinking, like the breath of something alive. The whispers swelled with it, rumbling through the ground, as though the orchard itself was one colossal, living body. Far off, in the shadows, something shifted. The gardener stood between two rows of withered trees, his narrow shoulders hunched. He didn't approach. He didn't vanish. He simply watched. His silent presence made Eleanor's skin crawl, but the voices at her ear tugged her back toward the roots. When she returned inside, a book waited on the table. Dust filmed the cover, its spine cracked and brittle, yet it lay open on a passage she knew she hadn't touched. Faded ink spelled out fragments, the forbidden fruit, the mingling of blood and soil, the feeding of souls. Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't left this here. Outside, the whispers pressed against the window panes, hammering every word into her skull. The night stretched long. Eleanor sat awake, rigid, her ears straining. Footsteps circled the house, measured, deliberate. The tread was unmistakable. Her own footsteps, the exact rhythm she had taken through the orchard that afternoon, now played back to her, endlessly, tauntingly. Each time they ceased, the whispers surged louder, faster, more insistent. Urging dial, waiting. By dawn, Eleanor slumped in her chair, her body hollow with exhaustion. But she knew the truth now. The orchard had found her. It would never release its call, and the whispers would not stop, not until she stepped deeper into its darkness. Okay. The day dragged on in a haze of exhaustion, yet Eleanor found herself unable to leave the house. Each time the thought of escape flickered through her mind, the whispers rose again, an invisible wall of sound pressing her back. She sat on the porch, eyes fixed on the orchard, watching the brittle branches twitch without cause. By nightfall, the fog rolled in heavy and thick, smothering the path. Moonlight washed the orchard in a pale glow, turning the trees into twisted pillars of bone. Heart pounding, Eleanor stepped into the mist. Her body trembled, but her feet carried her forward, deeper into the maze of dead rows stretching endlessly in every direction. The voices came clearer than ever before. Not just strangers now. Woven among them were the tones she knew by heart. Her father's stern voice, her mother's soft cadence, the faint laughter of her sister, long dead. The sound tangled around her, calling her name, flooding her mind with flickers of memory. Family dinners, warm hands once clasped, now nothing but dust. She shook, but her heart lurched toward them. At the orchard center, she stopped. From the fog emerged figures, blurred at first like vapor, then sharpening into faces. Her father's stern eyes, her mother in her faded dress, her sister with her hair cascading loose. They stood silent beneath the skeletal trees, their skin pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, their eyes bottomless, locked on Eleanor. She staggered back, but the faces did not fade. They drifted with her, step for step, yet no footfalls echoed on the ground. Only the whispers persisted, this time spilling from their closed mouths. Words without meaning tangled into a low, droning chant, warped and endless. In their midst, the lone green tree loomed, its twisted canopy alive with grotesque fruit. Apples glistened in the dark, shining like eyes. One dropped, rolling to Eleanor's feet. Its skin split open, revealing a child's smiling face before collapsing into a slick of black liquid that bled into the soil. The gardener appeared again. This time he was close, standing right beside the living tree. Moonlight carved his gaunt features into shadow and bone. His hollow sockets stared upward, while his thin hands clung to the bark. When his mouth opened, the same whispers poured out, merging seamlessly with the voices of the orchard, as if he too had become one of them. Eleanor realized she was sitting on the cold ground, though she couldn't remember lowering herself. The chill seeped through her dress, her trembling hands resting on her lap. Around her, the faces closed in, slowly leaning nearer, until the icy breath of their skin brushed hers. At the center, the tree quivered, its strange fruit trembling violently, as if feeding on her very presence. Above, clouds devoured the moon, plunging the orchard into suffocating dark. In that moment, Eleanor felt it. The orchard, inhaling, its breath filling her chest, exhaling in unison through her own lungs. The whispers roared in harmony, 1,000 voices braided into one. And for the first time, she understood. It was an invitation, a demand, a promise of reunion forever. And Adi, when dawn never came, the sky hung heavy, thick with a gray so dense it seemed to swallow the light itself. Eleanor sat motionless at the edge of the orchard, eyes locked on the lone green tree that pulsed with unnatural light. Around it, the dead trunks stood in their endless rows, but in the silence, she felt them waiting, as though each rotting vein of wood carried a faint, patient heartbeat. The faces emerged again through the fog. Not just her parents and sister now, but countless others. Strangers with hollow black eyes and sealed lips, their silence taut with demand. Yet, the whispers no longer came from them. They rose instead from the soil, from the roots, from the relentless pounding in Eleanor's chest. Her hand brushed the ground. The earth trembled, yielding soft and damp like living flesh. Beneath the grass, her fingers grazed sharp fragments, small bones, human teeth, rings tarnished with rust. The orchard was not merely dead, it had been fed. Every soul that vanished had seeped into its roots, its fruit, its endless murmurs. At the center, the green tree shuddered, convulsing with hunger. Apples cascaded to the ground, bursting open in wet cracks. Inside lay shreds of dark red tissue, scraps of shriveled skin. The air thickened with the stench of blood and rot, so heavy it clawed at the lungs. Eleanor swayed, her head swimming, yet her feet carried her closer. The faces leaned low, eyes burning with expectation, the circle closing in. They did not move, yet their silence pressed on her, an invisible weight driving her toward the tree. The whispers had become one sound now, a single, drawn-out note vibrating through her skull, a command, a summons to return to the source. She placed her hand on the trunk. The bark was cold, thrumming like a living pulse. In that instant, Eleanor felt herself unravel. Her breath, her blood, her very sense of self seeped downward into the veins beneath the soil. Darkness filled her vision, not with fear, but with a stillness so absolute it seemed to hum with hidden voices. By morning, the gardener stood among the trees, an empty basket in his hands. The green tree was heavy with fruit, its leaves lush, casting a cool shadow over the ground. There was no sign of Eleanor. Only the whispers remained, softer now, as though a new voice had been folded into their song. And from that day on, the orchard grew quieter than ever. But for those who dared to step close and listen long enough, there was always one more note in the chorus of the wind. Nilmende. In Montana, nestled among mist-laden mountains and dense pine forests, lies a lake so clear it is known as the Mirror Lake. Locals whisper that its surface is a veil between two worlds, a place where death never truly ends. They warn that anyone who gazes too long will lose themselves, while, at times, the departed will stare back from below. On nights when the moon is full, the lake glows like glass, reflecting not only what exists above, but also what was never meant to exist at all. You're me, child. Daniel, a former professor who had devoted his life to philosophy, arrived in Montana with nothing more than an old suitcase and a soul weighed down by grief. The sudden death of his son had carved an emptiness in him that no words or wisdom could mend. He chose Mirror Lake as his refuge, for it was said that the silence there could soothe even the most broken heart. On his first night, he sat at the shore, watching the moon scatter into 1,000 shards of light across the glassy surface. The lake was so still that every small movement of his body reflected back with unnerving clarity. Yet, something in the mirrored eyes staring up at him was not aligned. The reflection lingered a beat too long. Its faint smile faded, though Daniel was certain he had not smiled at all. A lone woman rode past in silence, her silhouette small and fragile against the shroud of fog. The ripples her boat left behind stretched outward, and Daniel saw more than her shadow on the water. For a fleeting moment, there appeared a line of figures standing behind her, motionless, waiting, before dissolving as the waves smoothed over. Daniel shut his eyes, desperate for stillness, but even in darkness, the lake remained carved into his mind. It was not simply water. It was a vast, unyielding mirror, a threshold waiting for something else to step through. Ni pai shui. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to the lake every afternoon. Sitting for hours on the shore, his gaze fixed on the crystal-clear water. The light shifted with the passing hours, yet the lake always retained its cold, mirror-like sheen, reflecting every cloud, every tree, every line of his face. And yet, at times, that reflection lagged a beat behind, as though it hesitated before responding. One evening, just as night fell, Daniel saw a figure appear beneath the surface. It was not his own reflection. It was a boy, standing in the still water, eyes wide open, staring upward. Daniel's heart clenched, for in that instant, the figure was achingly familiar. The narrow shoulders, the youthful face, it was his son, the one who had died in a terrible accident the year before. Daniel leaned closer. The surface of the lake remained smooth, lit only by the moon stretched into a blinding white streak. But below, the boy smiled. That smile did not exist in Daniel's last memory of him. It was slow, fixed, as if carved into an invisible sheet of glass. He reached out, touching the water. It was icy, seeping into his bones. Ripples spread outward, distorting the boy's face for a brief moment before it returned whole again. But this time, the boy's lips moved, as if whispering. Daniel heard no sound, yet the ripples against his skin formed a rhythm, like a voice trapped deep in a throat. Across the lake, a boat glided past. The woman who rowed sat motionless, her gaze fixed on Daniel. Her reflection on the water warped, stretched, and pressed close to the boy's image. But beneath the surface, her face was not the same. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, empty as a winter lake. Daniel turned away, and when he looked back, his son was gone. The following night, he returned again. This time, the boy appeared more clearly, as though rising closer to the surface. The moonlight traced his delicate features, but in his eyes lingered a heavy shadow. Daniel realized the small figure was standing in a warped world, a twisted version of the lakeside, where trees bent unnaturally and the sky lay torn apart. Grief and longing bound him in place. He knelt, his gaze locked on the image below. The lake had become a pane of thick glass, one that could shatter with the slightest touch. Every droplet of dew that fell rippled outward, like a door creaking open. And in the dreadful silence of the night, Daniel felt a hand, small and frozen, gently press against the shadow of his own, reaching out from the other side. Dinim, wawa, ana, ha, I'm sore. The next night, the wind from the forest blew cold, carrying the damp rot of decayed pine needles. Daniel sat by the lake, his gaze fixed on the still surface. The lake was like a massive pane of glass, reflecting the torn sky and the smudged silver moon. But when he leaned closer, the reflection warped, twisted like a painting in a distorted mirror. In the lake's surface, the pine tree behind him bent like broken bones. The moss-covered rocks became heaps of skulls. And in the midst of that warped scenery, the boy appeared again. His dark eyes shimmered, never leaving Daniel, his mouth opening in silence. Daniel strained to listen. At first, it was only the rustle of wind in his ears, but then an unfamiliar sound rose from the depths of the lake. A call, thin as a thread, stretching into the air, seeping into his chest. It wasn't just an echo. It seemed to come from inside his own ribcage, forcing his heartbeat to follow its rhythm. The surface of the lake trembled faintly, ripples crawling outward, stopping abruptly, as if something below was pounding against the glass, desperate to break through. Daniel trembled, but could not pull away. The moonlight stretched into a sharp streak, like a blade dividing two worlds. The boy raised his hand, the small palm pressing against the surface. Daniel's reflection did the same, but the movements didn't align. The figure in the water reached first, then lagged, then convulsed. The eyes of his reflection were filled with darkness, nothing like his own on the shore. The sound from the lake swelled, becoming a long, hollow drone, like a voice calling through thick glass. Daniel heard his own name, fractured in the endless echo. Each thread of sound tugged at him, promising reunion, promising an escape from grief. On the water's surface, the warped world expanded, spilling into the reflection of the sky. The moon fractured into a broken circle, its light dripping down like molten glass. Figures began to emerge behind the boy, hazy, motionless, their faces empty, yet their eyes all fixed on the shore. Daniel felt the ground beneath him soften. Stones, grass, everything seemed to slide toward the depths. The air thinned into mist, his lungs filled only with the smell of cold water. In that moment, a tiny hand broke through the surface, grasping his wrist. The skin was icy, but the grip so strong it sent blood surging through his veins. Daniel froze, caught between terror and yearning. The sound from the other side turned into a low, resonant whisper, inviting him across, urging him to close the gap between two worlds. And the lake was no longer a mirror. It had become a door, trembling like a thin veil ready to shatter, ready to swallow anyone who dared to look too deep. On the fourth night, Daniel returned to the lake on trembling legs. Moonlight poured down, and the water's surface gleamed like an enormous mirror. So cold it seemed that if he bent just a little closer, his skin would freeze into glass. The wind was still, yet the lake was not calm. It moved slowly, like a breathing creature, each rise sending ripples outward, pulling the darkness into its depth. Daniel looked down. The reflection no longer resembled him. The face in the water was older, its eyes sunken, its mouth stretched wide in a crooked grin. Behind that figure stood dozens of shadowy forms, arranged in a crescent, their hollow eyes fixed ahead. They encircled the boy, not touching, as if awaiting a ritual. The world around the shore began to change. Straight pine trees twisted and split, their hollow trunks peeling like charred skin. The sky cracked apart, stars dragged into streaks of falling light that plunged into the water. Daniel blinked, but the warped world remained, spreading from the reflection and bleeding into reality. He reached out to touch the lake. The surface was no longer cool and clear. It had thickened, viscous like molten glass. The boy pressed closer, his small hand tugging gently. Daniel leaned forward, his whole body weighed down, bones heavy, as if drawn by a magnetic pull below. The whispers rose into a chorus, echoing like an unseen choir. Their invitations wove with the breath of the wind, forming a ceaseless, resonant hymn. Daniel's ears rang, but within the chaos he heard his name distinctly, repeated, rebounding, as though the lake itself was calling him. The ground beneath him gave way. The damp grass softened into patches of cold mud, then dissolved, leaving nothing but water stretching into infinity. He was no longer sitting on the shore, but standing upon a colossal mirror where above and below merged into one. With each step he took, his reflection moved in reverse, lagging, distorting, until it no longer resembled him at all. The boy smiled. It was a rigid smile, like a crack etched across glass, stretching toward his ears. Within the warped reflection, the boy shone brighter than the moon itself, as if he were the center of the lake. The figures around him bowed their heads, leaned toward Daniel, as though welcoming one who had crossed the threshold. Daniel tried to step back, but behind him there was nothing, only the endless expanse of mirrored water. No shore, no ground. The sky above and the lake below blended into an empty void. He cried out, but his voice shattered instantly across the glowing surface, returning as a murmur not his own. A cold wind swept through, and in that instant, the boundary collapsed. The lake cracked apart, not with ripples, but like shattering glass, shards of blinding light scattering into the air. Daniel was pulled downward, his hands clawing helplessly at nothing. His son's image reached out, close enough to touch, but when his fingers closed, he grasped only emptiness. The world twisted, collapsing into a colossal whirlpool of silver, and at its center, the lake had become an open door, devouring the moonlight, and Daniel's soul along with it. Ah! As the silver vortex swallowed his body, Daniel fell into a bottomless expanse. There was no water, no sky, only shattered light drifting around him like fragments of suspended glass. In the emptiness, his heartbeat echoed back at him, merging with an endless murmur. From afar, a figure emerged. It was not his son, nor the faceless silhouettes that had once stood around the lake. The figure was tall, its body sheathed in a dull, translucent shell of glass, shifting with glimmers of liquid light. Its face bore no features, only a flat mask that reflected countless distorted visages, including Daniel's own, repeated, twisted, stretched into fractured smiles. The keeper of the lake moved forward, each step soundless, yet every stride cracked the mirrored ground beneath him, only for it to seal itself again. Around him, pale souls scattered back like mist swept aside by wind. They flickered, writhing, but did not scream. Instead, fragments of their reflections slipped away from their bodies and vanished into the void. Daniel staggered. He realized the boy was no longer there. His son's image had been nothing but a lure, an illusion the lake conjured to draw him across. The truth now stood before him, The keeper of the lake allowed no one to return. A massive hand clad in glass reached out and pressed against his chest. The cold pierced through flesh and bone, and his heartbeat ceased. Daniel looked up and saw himself reflected in the keeper's mask, his face elongating, dissolving into trembling ribbons of light, merging into the creature's body. No gravity, no will remained. Daniel felt his very self unravel, memories splintering and scattering like cracked glass. The image of his son receded, fading like a photograph drained of color, until it disappeared entirely. The keeper stepped back, letting him sink into the whirlpool of reflections. Daniel was no longer the lost wanderer. He had become one of the silent figures that once stood around the boy. His eyes were empty, his body transparent as a frozen lake in winter. Above, the surface sealed itself, smooth as though it had never stirred. Moonlight slid across, reflecting the night sky in flawless silence. On the shore, the woman in the boat dipped her oar, and the vessel drifted through the thickening fog. For just a moment, her eyes tilted toward the lake, where a new shadow had joined the endless ranks of those who would never be freed. And from that night on, Daniel never returned to the shore. Azimu,